thank you. Thanks for inviting me here. It's great to be here, actually. Newfoundland and St. John's in particular have been a big influence on me over the years, from knowing Jocelyn Green from the days of Raising the Roof, and Bruce Pierce over here, who I think everyone knows. He gets a little grumpy at times. No, he doesn't. He's never been grumpy once. And Sheldon Pollitt, who, through his work and the work of his team, and many of you are here today, I think is an inspiration for people across Canada and how to constantly think creatively about developing a response to youth homelessness that is respectful, that engages young people, and treats them like any other young person, right? So much can be learned, and I look forward to more opportunities to collaborate. I have my phaser here. Duck. Things could go crazy. Okay, so I'm going to do a presentation here, and this comes out of several years' work. I used to work in the homelessness sector in the 90s with young people who are homeless, and as I get older, and indeed I am getting older, it becomes less and less reasonable for me that we allow young people to languish in homelessness for any length of time at all. We have to do things very differently. And so what I'm going to talk about is things that I've learned from around the English-speaking world about innovative responses to homelessness, from the prevention side, but also looking at models of accommodation and support. So interesting things from Australia, interesting things from the United States, the United Kingdom, Ireland, of course, and Canada as well. Again, the work here and elsewhere that's quite interesting. So yeah, so I'm going to talk about 45 minutes-ish, and then we'll have questions. Okay, first let's start with just a basic overview of understanding what is youth homelessness. Here's some things that we know in Canada. We only had these stats for the past year, but on any given night there's about 6,000 young people who are homeless, who are involved some way in the system. This doesn't include young people who are couch surfing, staying with friends or family, but don't have a house. It's just people that we're aware of because they are either in shelters or day programs, that kind of thing. Over the year, it's about 37,000. And importantly, youth make up about 20% of the total homeless population, which is a real overrepresentation because we're talking about young people between, say, 16 and 24. It's a small age group, but makes up a sizable amount of people who are homeless. The other thing that I think is important as we go through this, and you want to keep in mind, is that many people who are chronically homeless adults, their pathway into homelessness started when they were teenagers. So what we do with young people who are homeless is crucial for them as individuals. It's crucial to addressing homelessness as a larger issue, and also important, I think, just in terms of how we think about, as a country, how we treat people of any age. So, defining youth homelessness. What I'm referring to are young people who are living independently without permanent housing and without the care of adults. So living independent, it could be on the streets, could be in a shelter, could be couch surfing at friends, that kind of thing. And the age range I mentioned before, the stats are 16 to 24. I would argue that we should consider homeless youth 13 to 24. The young people who are under 16, it depends on the province. There are different laws and jurisdictional differences, but young people who are 13, 14, 15 are amongst the most vulnerable in terms of homelessness to exploitation. So what do we know about the population? There's been a fair bit of research in Canada, and we know that about 2 out of 3 are male on the streets. The fact there are more men than women, I put down to the fact that the streets are so profoundly unsafe for young women, that many young women will stay in dangerous households instead of going to the streets, or once they wind up on the streets will make arrangements to get off, even if it means an unhealthy relationship. The risk of being sexually assaulted on the street if you're a woman is incredibly high. Some minority populations are overrepresented, depends where you are in Canada, but we do know, for instance, that Aboriginal youth are overrepresented everywhere. I'm at the point now where I think you can't really talk about homelessness in Canada unless you're also talking about Aboriginal homelessness at the same time. Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered youth are overrepresented between 20 and 40% of the population. And this is an important indicator because it suggests that homophobia contributes to youth homelessness, in that young people either can't stay in their household, in their school, in their community because of homophobia, which, in spite of progress that we've made, is still, I would argue, an allowable form of discrimination in this country. Institutions are allowed to discriminate based on sexual orientation. The average length of stay, most young people who become homeless cycle in and out, often many times, but for those who stay, who become chronic, the research we've done, it shows an average of 4 years. And that's huge, right, when you're talking about somebody who might be 18, 19 years old. And the final thing, when we talk about young people who are homeless, we really have to always be conscious of age difference, so that it matters. The issues that somebody who's 14 faces are very different from a 16 or 17-year-old, very different from a 21-year-old. And so, in some communities, we don't have any youth homeless services. They are expected to go into adult shelters, if there are any shelters at all. And even where we do have youth differentiated services, mixing 15-year-olds with 24-year-olds isn't necessarily the best thing either. So, the causes of youth homelessness. It's at this point, I think it's important to say that we need to understand that youth homelessness is different than adult homelessness in terms of its causes, in terms of the experience of homelessness, and therefore in terms of what we need to do about it. And we'll come to that later, but we have to stop taking adult responses and just change the age mandate and make it for youth. So when we talk about youth homelessness, most people go to the individual and relational factors because these are important. Over 90% of young people leave home because of conflicts with family members of one kind or another. Between 60 and 70% leave homes where they experience themselves physical, sexual, and or emotional abuse. That's incredibly high, right? And there's study after study puts it in that range. So the research on that is pretty solid. Many young people leave home because of mental health or addictions issues that might be their own or might be another family member's. And so those kind of family conflicts are part of the issue, but we have to move beyond, and it's important to think beyond that, because if you ask somebody why they become homeless, they will usually tell you biographical details. This happened, that happened, I was having trouble with my parents. But typically, what they don't talk about are the structural factors that underlie their homelessness, right? Like nobody says, I became homeless when the government of Canada canceled the National Housing Strategy in 1993, right? But they will say, I had a fight with my parents. The structural factors that produce youth homelessness, and we'll really hammer this home, are poverty that's increased in Canada, the fact that young people can't afford housing if they do leave home, whether under good conditions or because of conflict. They can't earn a decent living, because it depends on the jurisdiction. I'm not sure what the situation is here with the oil industry, or Alberta, there are some well-paying jobs, but in Ontario, there aren't, right? It's like minimum wage, part-time work. And other structural factors to take note of are things like discrimination. If you can't get housing or a job because of the color of your skin, or because you're lesbian, gay, or bisexual, or transgendered, then that's going to increase your chance of being homeless. And then the final thing I want to talk about are systems failures. Homelessness isn't just the product of individuals and these big meta structural factors. It's also we produce homelessness by dumping people into homelessness. And the big systems failures, they abound all over the place. But our education system doesn't serve young people who are marginal that well, young people who are struggling. But the key one to talk about, I think, is child protection. And I'm going to talk about that some more later. But we know from research across Canada, actually internationally this is true, that a high percentage of young people who wind up homeless were in the care of child protection services at some point. And so there's something happens in the transition from care, right? They're not transitioned into stable housing with the supports they need. We also discharge people from corrections, from juvenile detention, or if they're older, from adult corrections, into homelessness. As part of Get Tough on Crime strategy in Canada, we've cut out funding for these kind of supports, transitional supports, right? That's seen as a fluff, pull yourself up by the bootstraps. And it's quite interesting for governments that bang the drum of law and order. We know for a fact that if you discharge people from jail into homelessness, that the chance of reoffending goes through the roof. So in fact, Get Tough on Crime isn't a crime reduction strategy, it's a crime production strategy. And so I name all these things because this is going to speak to the kind of solutions we need to think about. That solving youth homelessness is not about motivating young people. It's not about giving them a resume and teaching them how to get a job. It's not even about fixing their family relationships. There's some bigger issues at play here that we need to work on. Dealing with family violence, dealing with addictions, dealing with changing opportunities for young people. Okay, so how else are youth different from the adult population in terms of causes? Well, the age thing matters, right, of course. But in thinking about that, you have to understand that many young people who are homeless are in the throes of adolescent development. And we know that adolescent development produces all kinds of physical, cognitive, behavioral, social changes that complicate life, that can in fact have an impact on decision making, and can lead to all kinds of problems in transitioning to a life of independence. Age matters because age discrimination exists, right? In different jurisdictions. In some jurisdictions, you can't rent a place if you're under 18 because the laws won't allow that rental property to be insured. You don't have the same access to benefits. You don't have the same rights. So age matters. Experience. Most young people who wind up homeless did not leave a household where they were paying rent and had experience dealing with landlords, dealing with healthcare, dealing with systems. They usually leave situations where they are dependent on adults who help them do those kind of things. And they're also enmeshed in systems of dependency and support. And we'll talk about this some more as we go on. That is that any young person has around them, not just parents, if there are parents, because there aren't always parents, but adults. They may have siblings that they depend on. They may have uncles and aunts or grandparents. They may have friends in the neighborhood. They may have neighbors. They may have teachers, coaches, instructors, adults. There's lots of people in their world that are important to helping them move forward. And sometimes when young people become homeless, they lose all of that. So let's talk about a strategy to end youth homelessness. And when I say ending youth homelessness, it doesn't mean that no young person is ever going to wind up leaving home without any options. But what we mean when we say end youth homelessness is we have to end it as a problem. We have to end it as a situation where young people get mired in homelessness for years. We have to end it as a situation where people have to leave school, where things happen to them, where they're exposed to exploitation. That's what we have to end. And then have in place an emergency service that's going to help young people who do have bad things happen to them transition to a new environment. So in developing a strategy to end youth homelessness, we have to develop something based on the needs of the developing young adolescent and young adult, right? So again, start with the idea that young people have different situation that leads to homelessness, and they'll have different needs getting out. Whoops. And here's a key thing in Canada, right? In dealing with homelessness, there's basically three things you can do. I'm told I can't walk over there, but I'm going to just go for a walk here. So there's three things, right? You can prevent people from becoming homeless in the first place, right? Do whatever you can to stop that from happening. But even if you do that, people are going to fall into homelessness at some time or another. Some people will. So you need an emergency response. And then you also need housing and supports. And in Canada, for the longest time, it's the middle area where we put all our effort and our investment. And that's understandable because when homelessness emerged as a crisis in the 80s and 90s, the first thing you're going to do when you see someone on the sidewalk is say, we have to get that person shelter. But we often get stuck there. And the story I told this morning, I'll tell again. Sorry if you were there this morning. hear it again, but if you think about the role of emergency response, it's to get you through a short-term crisis. It's not to become a permanent solution. So in Kelowna, BC, anybody ever been there? Yay! Finally, yes. So there was a fire in 2003 in Kelowna, BC, forest fire that moved towards the city, and eventually it hit the city and houses started burning down. So they had to evacuate people out of the area. They had to evacuate 23,000 people. And so people moved in with their friends or relatives if they had people nearby. Other people rented hotel rooms and they filled up really quickly. And the rest then, what they did is they opened up gymnasiums and hockey rinks and had people sleep on mats, right? And so that was an emergency response to people losing their housing. Now, if you went back today, 11 years later, and you went into a hockey rink and there were still people in Kelowna on mats on the floor of a hockey rink, you'd say, we have failed. We have totally failed. And that's not a critique of the emergency service providers. It means you haven't dealt with the problem. And I think that's how I feel about our response to homelessness in many places in Canada, is that we've come to rely on that emergency response as if that is the response. Everything's okay. Don't people have shelters to go to? Aren't there soup kitchens? That's not a response. It's an emergency response, but that doesn't solve homelessness at all. And for young people, it's particularly crucial because we know that the longer a young person is homeless, the more likely it is that they're going to get involved in exploitive situations, either in the sex trade or with drug dealing or other kinds of crime, all of which are further going to undermine their self-esteem and their ability to move forward in their lives. So the ability to shorten that time is crucial. So step number one, if we want to reimagine our response to youth homelessness, we have to move from this kind of a model of homelessness. Wow, that was pretty fancy. Forgot about that animation. To something that looks more like this. We're always going to need that emergency response, but it's got to be there doing what it's supposed to do. Short-term support. We have to shift the focus to prevention and to housing and supports. Okay. So I'm going to take 50 minutes. I'm bargaining for an extra 5 minutes. And I'm up here, so it's like, what can happen? A hook. Okay. Okay. So how do we get there? Is the key question. I think there are 5 key elements that are important in making that shift from the emergency response to one that focuses on prevention and accommodation supports. The first is to develop a plan. Like, you need to set out what you want to do. Your community is now developing a community plan on homelessness, which is going to be really good. I think, you know what, one of the next steps is, like, within that plan, how are you going to think about your youth response? What's your plan to end youth homelessness? Again, because they aren't one and the same. They overlap, but they're distinct. You also need to develop an integrated systems approach. So you can have really good programs, you can have really good agencies, but they will forever struggle. They'll be at the end of the stream picking babies out of the water until you have an integrated system. So that the way it should work then is that all the services working with youth, including schools, have to be part of the solution, have to work in an integrated way. So if someone's at risk of homelessness or becomes homeless, instantly they get assessed, they get access to the really good services, and those services are connected more broadly to mainstream services. So that service integration is important, but we also have to think about vertical integration. If we know that child protection failed transitions from child protection lead to youth homelessness, then they have to be at the table as part of the solution. If we know that people aren't getting the mental health supports that they need, they have to be at the table. Corrections have to be at the table. You need in government a more integrated response. A system of care, right, that puts young people at the center and their needs, meaning that we don't fit the young person to the system, but that the system responds to the young person. But we also need that facilitated and coordinated approach by all levels of government. And here's why. Youth homelessness is not just the responsibility of the sector. And that's one of the things we often get lulled into believing. As I said before, you know, we're comfortable, oh, we have shelters and day programs. Aren't we taking care of things? No, we will never solve homelessness if we make it the responsibility of an underfunded sector. Youth homelessness is what I would call a fusion policy issue. All these other mainstream services and parts of government have to be part of the solution to homelessness. So addictions and treatment, the education system, child protection, training, corrections, mental health, income supports. All of these things are part of the solution to homelessness. And if you can get those things coordinated and get a commitment and an engagement by those other parts of society, your chance of succeeding with prevention and with getting people housed with the supports they need are going to go way up. So we need to think that way. And that's not easy to do, by the way, but it's crucial to do. And the fourth thing is we have to adopt a youth development focus. Again, we can't take, as I said before, you can't take adult homeless services and just change age mandate and have adult homelessness junior, right? You have to develop something based on the needs of developing adolescent and young adult. And differentiation based on age, so 13, 14, 15-year-olds are going to need different responses than 20-year-olds, as they say. And we have to pay attention to diversity, right? So young people who are lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, we better make sure if they left home because of discrimination, we better make sure our services don't reproduce that, right? So anti-discrimination work is important. And finally, we have to do this based on an understanding that the world is different now. Like a lot of our systems for young people, whether it's school or child protection or training, are based on a world that existed long ago that doesn't exist anymore. So across Canada, how old can people be under the care of child protection here in this province? 21, so it's a bit higher, okay. In Ontario, it's 18, so it ranges. I think Alberta is the first province that's going to go push for 24. Could be wrong, but you know, basically 18, 19, 20, 21. That was based on a time when you could leave home at 16, 17, 18, go get a job in a factory, rent a place, move on with your life. Those days are gone, long gone. There's now a rise in credentialism, meaning you need more education than you used to get any job, right? So people stay in school longer. Do you know what the dropout rate in Canada is? Anyone want to guess? Okay, I'll guess. What's that? 14, that's a good guess. Often people say 30% because the rate in the 1980s was 30%, early 1980s. The dropout rate in Canada is below 9% now. Most people complete high school. Why? Because you need to stay in school to get a decent job. The dropout rate amongst homeless youth, the research I've done, it's over 60%. I don't know in choices like what the high school completion rate is, but I'd say it's without your assistance, like not in school, right? So that, you know, if you think in terms of their long term, their life, that's puts them at a huge disadvantage because we know from research that if you compare those who fail to complete high school with those who do, there are lifelong differences in terms of use of government services, in terms of ability to get and maintain jobs, in terms of health and well-being. So we must take care of that. The second difference is that full-time jobs paying living wage are scarce now, as I just mentioned before. Most people can only get low-paying part-time work. And the final thing is because of low wages and high housing costs, young people stay at home longer. The percentage of young people in Canada between 20 and 29, this isn't 20 and 25, but 20 and 29, who are living with their parents is over 42%. That's huge, right? So any of you who have kids, you think they're leaving when they're 18? It's not going to happen. They're staying at home because they can't leave. It's not because it's like, oh good, I love it here. You know, thank you, mom and dad. I know this because I have young people in 20s who are just moving out now. But it's just not possible. So the world's changed, right? Young people have to stay home longer. Young people have to stay in school longer. The transition to adulthood takes much longer. Why do we continue to develop and implement services that are based on what it was like in the 1980s, right? Why do we keep doing that? Our support for young people who are in care should be extended until they're 25, right? All of our services should provide young people who are homeless or without supports with the same supports that somebody who's housed gets, which means time to make changes, time to learn adult skills, time to make mistakes, time to make positive changes, time to move out but move back home. That's the kind of system we need, something that's based on the needs of young people. Okay, and part of this is a conceptual shift. We have to move away from just thinking that the goal of working with homeless youth is get them out. Let's train them up, get them out, off you go. That's not the goal. The goal is transitions to adulthood. How do we help young people achieve their goals? How do we help them become included in communities? How do we help them feel empowered and respected? How do we help them take advantage of opportunities? Right? All of these things are things that we would wish on any of our own children, wish for them. Why can't we develop a system that does the same for young people who are homeless? And then finally, we need to incorporate research, data gathering, and information sharing. And I know all of you are going, yeah, well, you're a researcher. Of course, you believe in that. But we need to do a better job, right, of understanding what are the needs of young people, providing them with the right kind of care, and figuring out what happens to them. We have a lot of gaps in research. I'll give you an example. Actually, we're talking about research agenda. One thing we don't know in Canada very well, what happens when young people do leave care, right? It's kind of a black hole. We don't know. We do know that a lot wind up homeless, but we don't know the paths of a lot of people, right? So these are things that are important to pay attention to. So let's look then at preventing homelessness and then housing, accommodation, and supports. Watching that clock there. Okay, first preventing. I think prevention is one of those things that everybody agrees with, right? Like it's better to not smoke cigarettes than to smoke and then have to quit, right? So it's better to prevent the measles than to get it and treat it, that kind of thing. So, you know, telling people we should prevent homelessness, most people get it. But when you ask what does it really mean, then it sometimes gets a little more complicated. And we're starting to figure it out. We're starting to come up with a way of framing it, right? And so I think there are 3 areas of prevention that we should focus on. Primary prevention, systems prevention, and early intervention. And I'll go through each of these. Primary prevention means working upstream to prevent new cases. So we need to focus on things like child abuse. We need to take care of that kind of thing. We need to work, we need to do outreach. We need to find young people when they're at risk. And that includes the places that really make a big change on prevention are places like Australia, where they actually have in schools people who work in the homeless sector, who work with teachers and young people, right, around education, but also if there's any sign of any problems, helping them. Maybe it's family reconnection work or family mediation work, these kinds of things. So you need to get in schools. That's my high school there, by the way. Isn't it beautiful? Bruce, I think you went there too. No. Yeah. We need to work with families as part of prevention, right? Because sometimes, you know, if we know that over 90% of young people leave home because of family conflict, then maybe we should put some more resources in supporting families in trouble. If 60 to 70% of young people left home because of abuse, then that means they can't stay in that household. But it doesn't mean that their families are irrelevant. Because even if you've been in an abusive situation, you might have a sibling or one parent or an uncle or an aunt who's still meaningful to you. So we need to work to nurture those kind of supports. Where there's family conflict that just stems out of, you know, other issues, there's all kinds of issues that can produce that. We need to help families and young people together to help them stay housed. Because again, if someone leaves their home, typically they lose more than their home. As I said, they lose that nest of relationships, their friends, their teachers, everyone else, when they have to leave home and move to a place where there's a youth shelter. We have to build our notion of support for young people around the rights of children and youth. Canada signed the International Convention on the Rights of Children and Youth, which states that the government is responsible for the care of all young people up to the age of 18 to ensure that they have access to safe housing, that they have access to education, that they have access to food. We signed on to that as a country, and we don't do that. We don't do that, so we need to do that. And we need to work on anti-discrimination. Again, because sometimes young people's problems are really somebody else's problems. So systems prevention, this is zero discharge into homelessness is the philosophy we should take. We have to fix those systems that dump people into homelessness. And this is just 3 of them here. And so I've been talking a bit about child protection reform, and I think this is really important. And the reason, again, is that if we know 60 to 70% of homeless youth experience physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, we have to do a better job of dealing with that. If 40 to 50% of homeless youth were in foster care or group homes, we know that, then there's a problem. That suggests 2 problems. One is that there's the transitions from care are not working, but the other is that we're missing a lot of young people who are experiencing physical, sexual, and emotional abuse. As a crisis response, it's not working. It's not working well enough. We need to update child protection legislation and not do it in a piecemeal way, because that's the way it happens in most jurisdictions. We add on, we advance the years a bit. We need to ensure that young people in care and transitions from care receive priority, right? And don't just become an added on task for agencies and services that are mostly designed to support children. And we can learn from excellent models of reform elsewhere in the world. And Scotland has just implemented new legislation and programming to deal with youth in care, which means the state is responsible for them up to the age of 25. They can move in and out of care, just like my kids can move in and out of my house. And they get funding to go to school or training. They get support if they want to work. They get access to housing, right? So that they don't have to worry about losing it all. Scotland has implemented it. That was a radical reform. England has something that's halfway on the way to that. We can learn from these places and adapt. We can steal those ideas. They won't mind. We're on the other side of the ocean. Same thing we need to think about is discharge planning from corrections. I'm going to try and move through the rest of this a bit quickly. And finally, the third thing is early intervention when someone becomes or is about to become homeless. And I'll use this diagram to explain this. When someone's at risk, imminent risk of homelessness, we need to first assess them. We have to know that they're at risk, so we need outreach in place, right? We can't help someone at imminent risk of homelessness if we don't know they're at imminent risk. So we have to be in the place where we will find out where they are. They need case management from the get-go. Let's not just let people flounder around for years. Right from the get-go, we need to do that. We need to look at family reconnection because there are 2 possible pathways. We can help young people return back home with supports for their family, or we want to move them into housing and so with supports as quick as possible. And we need to look at shelter diversion. And shelter diversion there's some really good examples of this. Timeout housing, a lot of communities do this where people, volunteers in the community who have an extra room will be there if a young person gets kicked out or there's an argument. And sometimes all families need is a little breathing space, a little cooling off period. But when that happens, you put someone in that situation, instantly you start in with the case management and give them the supports they need. But definitely do it from a youth perspective. It has to be youth driven. Let's look at models of accommodation and support. Housing First. How many people here have heard of Housing First? Almost everyone on that side. Okay, so Housing First is like a new big deal in Canada in homelessness. And the government of Canada is endorsing it as part of their policy. It's one of the interventions on homelessness for which there is the most convincing research available. And what this research suggests is that rather than let people languish in shelters until they're ready to be housed, so let them take care of their addictions or whatever, put them in housing first. Give them choice about where they're going to live and give them the kind of supports that they choose. Do it without preconditions, without them having to demonstrate sobriety, and work on engagement. And here's what the research says. You can take the most hardcore, long-term homeless person with addictions and mental health issues, that person that pushes around a shopping cart, that the Joe Public thinks chooses to be homeless and wants to be homeless. You put them in housing and give them the right supports, and you know what? They stay housed. Because people who are homeless are not any different than you and me. They want house, they want security, they want safety, and they want respect. So Housing First, the research on it is pretty convincing about whether it works. But the research on Housing First for youth is pretty thin. We know it works for adults, but does it work for youth? And I've been making the case that we have to treat things differently, not just take adult models and apply them to youth. And so there's 2 studies that I'm aware of on youth homelessness. One is on the project in Calgary, the Infinity Project, where they work with young people 18 to 24, use the traditional housing first model, but do it with a youth focus, right? So they definitely take a youth development approach. After the first year, 95% of the people who went into the program retained their housing. Incredibly high rate of success. Another study by Cheryl Forchuk suggests that it's a little more complicated, arguing that many young people found that having to deal with the responsibility of their own household, taking care of the rent, dealing with landlords was a little too much when they were trying to deal with their addictions issues at the same time. And so they preferred more of a transitional model where they had other kinds of, where they had housing, but they had different kinds of support. So the research is, at some level, that looks like it's contradictory, but I'm going to argue that both of those things are actually arguing kind of the same thing if we look at it. So what we've done, and we've got a report on this, is we've created a framework for Housing First for Youth with these core principles. And what it does is it modifies the adult principles for young people. So again, immediate access to housing, youth choice and self-determination, positive youth development orientation, individualized and client-driven supports, meaning harm reduction is at the center of it, right? And we'll talk about harm reduction in a minute, and social and community integration being key. It's both a program and a philosophy, meaning that as a philosophy, if you adopt it in a community, it means that all your services are directed towards the idea that young people are going to do better if they're housed with the supports that they need. You still need emergency services, but don't rely on your emergency services or imagine that that is the solution. Housing is the key. You got to get people into housing, but it raises a question. What kind of housing are you going to have for young people? And so the adult model is kind of premised on the idea that we should use what's called scattered site housing, which is private sector housing, rents for people, get them into housing in the community, and that really works really well. I argue that for young people, we need a more differentiated model that is, again, based on the choice of young people and their needs. So some young people, the Housing First model is to help them return home as quickly as possible. For other young people, they're going to need permanent supportive housing because of their needs, high acuity mental health or addictions. Some people are going to be able to move into independent living, that model. They get the keys, they get the, they get their own place and with supports. Some will need high level supports, others will need minimal supports. They just need help getting the housing. Off they go. And then some are going to need transitional housing, and I'm going to talk more about that later. And there's some really good models of transitional housing, including right here in St. John's, Newfoundland, that are models that should be emulated elsewhere. Transitional housing doesn't mean no housing. It just, and it isn't in opposition to Housing First. In fact, I think it should be incorporated within the model for young people. And I think we need to think about those differences in housing in terms of age appropriateness. It may be that the older youth are more ready and able to get into independent living. Legally, it's, as I said, in some jurisdictions, you can't house people in private housing if they're under 18. Younger people tend to want the transitional housing more, and our research showed that that was a desire. Many young people did want that congregate living environment. They preferred that when they were younger. One young fellow I remember was telling me that, when he was 16, he'd never had any close family, and so he actually loved the transitional housing. He had his own room, but they had a common eating area and living room area, and he stayed in. He said, I avoided the partying and all that. It was really good. I learned life skills, and then I moved into a more independent situation, and now he lives independently. And he values independent living, but he was like, at that point in my life, I needed something else. Whoop. My phaser's dead. Uh-oh. Oh, there we go. Okay, supports. What kind of supports do we need? Hockey pucks for everyone. Should be soccer balls this week. Okay. There's 5 levels of support here, and I'm going to quickly go through these. What time do we have? Oh, okay. I'm going to try and wrap this up. So to put it simply, for housing supports, people need help getting housing. They need help dealing with landlords. They may need rent supplements to stay in their housing, and they need help if things go wrong, because often for young people, the first time they get a house, things might go wrong. They might bring in a group of 20 friends to stay with them for a week, and the landlords don't, right? The landlords don't look, I'm looking at Cheryl there, don't necessarily like that. And so we need that kind of support. We also need aftercare, right? So when people get housed, they may need care down the road, just like my kids when they leave home. 2 years from now, they will probably need some kind of care. They need attention to health and well-being. Trauma-informed care is really key. Most young people, if they come from abusive backgrounds, come to the streets having experienced trauma. The experience of being homeless can make that experience of trauma even more. We need to focus on harm reduction as an approach, which means abstinence is an option, but is not a requirement. We have to deal with young people and their addictions issues where they're at, right? And this is tough for some organizations, but the research is really clear. If you force somebody into treatment when they're not ready, it will not work. It's a waste of time, right? And so we have to do approaches that reduce the risk of substance use for young people where they're at. And there are lots of issues around this. The youthful age of clients, some people are uncomfortable. When I worked in the sector, it's like, I really don't think I could do a needle exchange with a 14-year-old. And it's like, well, that 14-year-old is injecting drugs into their arm. So you better do it, right? It becomes a challenge when you house people, right, if they're using substances. So part of that harm reduction work is how do you do it in a way that doesn't jeopardize your housing, these kinds of things. Income and education. The choices model is a classic one, right? So there's support for training, but also at the same time support for education if young people want it. We really have to put the emphasis on education. Not everybody's going to want to or be able to go back to school, but we do know that education makes a difference in long-term outcomes for people. And we have to help young people get jobs. But it's not enough to just help people get jobs. Complementary supports are life skills, helping people learn how to take care of places, family reunification, then finally, meaningful engagement, right? Again, operating from a model of respect, we have to help young people develop social relationships, nurture relationships. We have to help them and get involved in communities and be welcomed by communities, not rejected, not seen as being a problem, but being embraced by communities. We have to support cultural engagement and help young people find meaningful activities. All of these things you would do for any young person, right? So why wouldn't we do this for young people? Okay, and this is a quote from somebody who is in Housing First program in Calgary. So Housing First, I think, makes sense for youth as long as we modify it according to those kind of principles. Okay, you can find out about this by going to the Homeless Hub. Here's a plug. It's all free stuff. Swag, free stuff. Loot bags for everybody, okay? But I'm going to just close now with just a very short overview. I mentioned the role of transitional housing. The reason I raise it is that with the push for Housing First, when it's understood incorrectly, often transitional housing is tossed aside. It's like, we shouldn't do that. We should just focus on scattered site. And as I said, many young people prefer it. And I have a confession to make here. These are my two youngest sons, and they both live in transitional housing. And that transitional housing is my house, right? They're there, they get support, they're expected to work, they're expected to go to school. One dropped out this past year. They make mistakes, they do wonderful things, but you know what? Someday they're going to have to leave. So it's transitional. I think any housing that a young person has is transitional. Even permanent housing isn't permanent, it's transitional. If you're renting a place, it's transitional. All housing for young people is transitional. And so we have to not look at it as a negative thing. The key with transitional housing is it has to have the kind of supports we talked about with Housing First. So focus on supports around meaningful engagement, around life skills, around health and well-being, these kinds of things. And a really good model is the Foyer, which began in the United Kingdom, and they started about 1992, and now there's over 120 of them. It's a model, it's a transitional housing model that puts education at the middle, gives young people a longer period of time, right? Because a lot of transitional housing models are time delimited, right? And it's like my transitional housing for my kids. That's not time delimited, right? In a world, as I said, where over 42% of people live with their parents well into their 20s, how can we say you have transitional housing for 1 year? We have to let people have it as long as they need it. That may seem expensive, but over the long run, that's going to pay huge dividends. Running out of time, so I think I'll just wrap up this stuff. If you want to learn more about foyers, that's another type of housing for which there's a lot of good evaluation research. So we do know that that works. If anyone tells you transitional housing doesn't work, they need to go read the research on foyers. And so just as we had the Housing First framework, we also have a report on foyers on the Homeless Hub as well, and a toolkit for implementing it that shows the research base for it and gives you a model for how to do it. So anyway, I'm going to close now. How to wrap that up. I could have gone on and on, but I need an editor really badly. So anyway, that's a quick overview. There's lots of these kind of resources on the Homeless Hub. There's the URL. And we work with other communities, including here, to develop innovative and effective and respectful responses to youth homelessness. So any questions or comments? And there's a cough.